Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your stack of source material, all these articles on history, economics, and regional quirks, and we turn it into the essential knowledge you really need.
And today, we're trying to decode a real paradox.
Yeah, the true identity of Connecticut.
It's just the definition of oversized influence in a small package.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you look at the sources, it's this compact state, right, tucked right there in the Northeast corridor.
Mm-hmm.
But its footprint, historically, politically, financially, is just gigantic.
Okay, so let's unpack that identity by starting with the names, because Connecticut is a state known by so many different, sometimes contradictory nicknames. We can use these to kind of set the stage for our deep dive.
Exactly. The official one, of course, is the Constitution State.
Right.
And that name is formal, it's historical, and it points directly to Connecticut's absolutely foundational role in American governance. It was officially adopted in 1959.
And that official identity is really robust. But the unofficial names, I mean, they give us so much more personality. Yeah. The best known is the Nutmeg State. When I was reading the suggested origins for this one, I realized it speaks to this fundamental Yankee wit and maybe a little bit of sharp business practice.
It certainly does. We've got two main theories here. The first one is that the name just came from Connecticut sailors bringing valuable nutmeg back from these long overseas voyages.
And nutmeg was a huge deal back then.
A massive deal. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was often worth more than its weight in silver. So that was a strong trade link.
But the second theory is so much more entertaining, and I think more culturally telling.
I agree.
It suggests that these Yankee peddlers, traveling merchants from the state, would sell these small wooden knobs they'd carved to look exactly like nutmegs.
To unsuspecting customers.
Exactly, who would only realize they'd been had after they tried to grate them.
And that element of, slight trickery, that confidence game, it became a key part of the regional stereotype for a while. It's a very memorable name because it reflects that early commercial shrewdness.
Okay, and then we have the Provision State, which is high praise coming from none other than George Washington.
It is. Washington himself gave Connecticut that title during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
And it was because of the sheer volume of material aid and agricultural support the state provided to the Continental Army.
They were just reliable.
Totally. They supplied soldiers, cattle, grain, arms. They were really crucial for sustaining Washington's army during its operations near New York City.
And finally, the sources mention the land of steady habits. That sounds a little bit polite, maybe a bit boring.
It's a little state, yeah. But when you connect it to the geography, it really makes sense.
Uh-oh.
That steadiness is partially, geographic destiny. Connecticut is the third smallest state by area. It's just after Rhode Island and Delaware.
Right.
But it's the fourth most densely populated. That compactness, situated right between New York City and Boston, created this really concentrated economic and political environment.
So, our mission today really is to unpack how this small foundational state, a land of written laws, shrewd traders, steady defense production, how it transformed into a financial powerhouse.
And crucially, one of the nation's most affluent, yet incredibly profoundly unequal financial centers.
We have to follow that thread of contradiction.
Let's jump right into Section 1 then. The foundational roots from tidal rivers to written laws. And we should start with the name itself.
Connecticut, where does that word actually come from?
It's directly tied to the geography. The name, it derives from the Mohegan Pequot word Connecticut.
Connecticut.
Yeah, and it translates to long tidal river. And that long tidal river is, of course, the Connecticut River.
The longest river in all of New England.
Exactly. And historically, it was the central artery for transportation, trade, settlement, everything.
And the sources remind us that human history in this valley goes way back. I mean, evidence of human presence dates back an astonishing 10,000 years.
Before the Europeans arrived, the area was home to various Algonquian tribes, the Nipmuc, the Narragansett, the Pequot Mohegan, and the Mattabesic.
And they had a whole system worked out.
They did. These tribes largely followed a semi-nomadic lifestyle, moving seasonally to capitalize on resources. So fishing along the coast and river, planting crops like corn and beans.
And then moving inland for hunting.
Right. It was a finely tuned ecological system that the European colonial scramble would, soon completely shatter.
And that scramble started with the Dutch. The first European explorer in 1614 was a Dutchman, Adrian Block, who mapped the coast.
The Dutch were all about the fur trade. That was the prize.
So in 1633, Dutch fur traders sailed up what they called the Verse Rivier, the Fresh River.
And they established this short-lived settlement named House of Hope It was at Dutch Point,
Mm.
what's now Hartford, a really strategic trading post.
But the English arrived in the very same year, 1633, at Windsor. And that really marked the beginning of the end for the Dutch presence.
The key wave, though, came in 1636. A large migration of Puritans from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, led by Reverend Thomas Hooker.
And they established the Connecticut colony at Hartford. Hooker famously believed that the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people.
Right, but this Puritan migration wasn't consolidated under one banner, at least not at first. You had several independent political entities forming almost at the same time.
You had the Saybrook colony, established in 1635 at the mouth of the river.
And more importantly, you have the New Haven colony, founded by John Davenport and Theophilus Eaton in 1638.
Okay, why was the New Haven colony so important in this early period?
Because the New Haven colony itself had this really profound document, the Fundamental Agreement, signed in 1639. It was an independent, theocratic government, and it initially rivaled the Hartford-based Connecticut colony.
And they eventually merged.
They did. The sources note that both colonies eventually merged, with New Haven being incorporated into Connecticut in 1664. But this early burst of, local self-governance set the stage for the state's most famous claim to fame.
Which brings us right to the core of the state's identity, the Constitution state justification. This is where we have to talk about the fundamental orders of 1639.
Yes. These orders, adopted in January 1639 by the settlers of Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor, are what many historians consider to be the first written constitution in Western history to establish a framework for government.
So what makes them so groundbreaking? I mean, it's not just that they were written down, it's the content, right?
It's absolutely the content.
Tell me specifically what makes them constitutional in the modern sense. What were they doing that was so revolutionary for 1639?
Okay, so they established three key things. First, they laid out the framework for the state government with clear rules for elections.
Yeah.
The annual election of the governor and magistrates by the freemen.
So a clear process.
A clear process. Second, and this is crucial, they established this framework without any official sanction or royal approval from the English crown at the time. They were just claiming independent authority.
That's a huge step.
It's massive. And third, unlike the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the fundamental orders did not limit voting rights to church members. This is a radical step toward broader elected representation, establishing a civilian body of authority above any clerical influence.
That is just a staggering piece of political technology for the 17th century. But while they were drafting these amazing frameworks for liberty, this was not a peaceful time.
Not at all.
We have to address the defining conflict of this early period, the Pequot War of 1637.
The Pequot War was a critical, brutal inflection point, and it was driven by multiple factors: increasing colonial territorial expansion, control over the very lucrative wampum trade, and the Pequot's own aggressive attempts to consolidate power against rival tribes like the Mohegan and Narragansett.
The flashpoint was the murder of an English privateer and a trader in 1636.
Right. The colonists responded by raiding a Pequot village. The Pequots then retaliated violently, laying siege to the Saybrook colony and conducting a devastating raid on Wethersfield in the spring of 1637, where they killed several English settlers.
And that mobilized the colonists.
It did. They organized a joint militia force from Connecticut and Massachusetts, and critically, they allied themselves with the rival Mohegan and Narragansett tribes who were, eager to curb Pequot dominance.
The sources describe the attack on the fortified Pequot village near the Mystic River in May 1637 as just horrific.
It was essentially a surprise attack. The colonial forces, led by Captain John Mason, surrounded the palisade, set fire to the village, and then shot the inhabitants as they tried to flee.
The death toll estimates are grim.
Yeah, ranging from 300 to 700 Pequots, mostly women, children, and the elderly.
And that was basically the end of the war.
It was. The subsequent months saw the organized Pequot resistance just crumble. They suffered another major loss at the Battle of Fairfield, and then the Pequots sued for peace. This effectively ended their organized resistance and profoundly reshaped the power dynamics in New England, securing English dominance for the rest of the century.
So we have a colony established on revolutionary legal documents, but secured through brutal military conflict. How did this self-governing entity then translate its local wisdom into the founding of the federal government decades later?
It was Connecticut's turn to shine again in 1787. Their delegation to the Constitutional Convention, led by Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth, played this pivotal bridging role. They were instrumental in solving what was arguably the biggest obstacle to forming the United States,
The representation crisis.
a representation crisis between the large and small states.
And this is the famed Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise. It's what we still use today.
Precisely. The large states wanted representation based on population, right?
Mhm.
So their bigger numbers meant more power.
Mm-hmm.
The small states demanded equal representation for every state, regardless of size. So the Connecticut Compromise provided this elegant solution, a bicameral legislature, 2 houses.
The result was the House of Representatives, where representation is proportional to the state's population, which satisfied the large states.
And the Senate, where every state, large or small, gets equal representation, 2 senators. And that satisfied the small states.
That design was so effective that it immediately became the foundation of the federal legislative branch.
And the sources note that this bicameral structure has been copied by almost every state constitution written since. It is Connecticut's most lasting and profound legacy on the American political structure.
And so, reflecting that influence, Connecticut became the 5th state to ratify the U.S. Constitution on January 9, 1788.
Yep.
Before we move on, we have to talk about something truly spectacular: Connecticut's early land claims. This is where the state, geographically tiny as it is, revealed an almost impossibly large ambition.
This is a real aha moment about American history that most people just forget. The 1662 colonial charter, which John Winthrop the Younger got from King Charles II, it didn't just define the Connecticut River Valley.
No.
It granted Connecticut all the land stretching westward to the South Sea, which was their term for the Pacific Ocean.
The entire width of the North American continent, claimed by a colony the size of a postage stamp. How did that claim actually cause trouble?
Well, it immediately caused conflict with neighboring colonies whose grants overlapped. Most famously, it led to the Pennamite-Yankee Wars with Pennsylvania,
Because Connecticut claimed the Wyoming Valley.
a territory that ran right through the middle of modern-day Pennsylvania.
And the sources show Connecticut didn't just make a paper claim, they actively tried to govern it.
They absolutely did. They established something called Westmoreland County, treating it as the 9th county of Connecticut, right there between the Susquehanna and Delaware rivers.
Wow.
And this led to decades of sporadic fighting, mostly low intensity, thankfully, between settlers from Connecticut, the Yankees, and settlers from Pennsylvania, the Pennamites.
But ultimately, they couldn't hold on to a claim that spanned 3,000 miles, could they?
No. After the Revolution, under pressure from the brand new federal government, Connecticut ceded most of that massive western claim as part of the Northwest Territory.
But they kept one substantial, valuable chunk of land.
They did, the Connecticut Western Reserve in present-day Ohio.
And what was the impact of keeping that reserve?
Well, it was reserved for the state to use, often for land sales to benefit educational efforts back home in Connecticut. And the land was settled overwhelmingly by people migrating directly from Connecticut.
Ah, and the sources highlight that this is why you see dozens of place names from Connecticut, like Norwalk, Greenwich, and Windsor, directly imported into Ohio.
Exactly. They finally ceded that reserve to the federal government in 1800, bringing the state to its current compact boundaries. But the cultural and political DNA was already spread across the frontier. That small state's constitutional and territorial claims really did shape a colossal continent.
That foundational chapter, built on written law, war, and this huge continental ambition, it sets the stage perfectly for the state's second great act, becoming the industrial forge, a center of maritime power, manufacturing, and defense.
Right, and the shift from legal foundation to industrial engine was powered first by its geography. Despite being so compact, Connecticut has a strong maritime tradition. It has over 600 miles of coastline, if you count all the navigable rivers and bays.
And that coastline wasn't exposed to the open Atlantic. It was protected by the Long Island Sound estuary. That sounds like a perfect environment for early shipbuilding and trade.
It was sheltered and commercially accessible. So colonial development fostered this tradition of building sloops, schooners, and brigs. And after the Revolution, trade it absolutely exploded.
Seaports flourished.
From trade, whaling, fisheries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The sources have a fantastic statistic on the scale of that prosperity.
The numbers are staggering for such a young state. In just one decade, between 1800 and 1810, Connecticut shipwrights launched nearly 1,000 vessels.
1,000.
That wasn't just local traffic. That was international commerce taking off.
But that growth hit a snag during the War of 1812. The British instituted a really comprehensive naval blockade of the Connecticut coast.
And that blockade severely hurt exports and shipping. But this moment of crisis actually accelerated the state's industrial transition. With imports cut off, necessity spurred the construction of inland factories to manufacture textiles and machinery.
It also birthed a naval hero, Derby native Isaac Hull.
Yeah, the celebrated captain of the USS Constitution who earned recognition for his victory over the HMS Guerriere.
So after the war, the maritime focus broadened.
It did. The first half of the 19th century saw New London emerge as a major hub for the American whaling industry. It became one of New England's top 3 home ports, ranking just behind the giants of Nantucket and New Bedford.
And the scale of shipbuilding continued to advance rapidly. We're talking industrial proportions, far beyond the small sloops of the colonial era.
Absolutely. The sources detail the construction of these massive steam-powered paddle wheelers in Noank, including the 332-foot Rhode Island in 1882 and the 345-foot Connecticut in 1889.
Wow.
The state's shipyards launched more than 165 steam-powered vessels in the 19th century alone, which shows a clear shift toward industrialized maritime transport.
This industrial momentum leads directly into Connecticut's identity as the arsenal of the nation. And this shift was largely accelerated by technological innovation, right?
Yes. The presence of navigable rivers and skilled mechanics laid the groundwork. But innovators like Eli Whitney, who perfected the concept of interchangeable parts for mass production, especially firearms, that's what cemented the state's role as a major manufacturing center during the Industrial Revolution.
So when the Civil War broke out, Connecticut was primed.
It became an essential supplier to the Union forces. Manufacturers supplied weapons and ammunition, leveraging those early advances in mass production. The state furnished a significant 55,000 men to the Union cause.
And Glastonbury native Gideon Welles served a crucial role as Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy.
A huge role, but the true height of its defense dominance came during the World Wars.
The mobilization during World War I was just extraordinary.
It was. The sources note that by 1918, 80% of state industries had pivoted entirely to producing war goods. The concentration of small arms manufacturing was unprecedented.
Can you give me some specific examples of that industrial capacity?
Sure. Take Remington Arms in Bridgeport. They produce half of all the small arms cartridges used by the U.S. Army during WWI.
Half.
And then Colt in Hartford and Winchester in New Haven were the other 2 major pillars, supplying millions of rifles and pistols. Also strategically important, the Navy established its East Coast submarine base and school in Groton in 1916.
And that acceleration didn't slow down for World War II. If anything, it magnified.
It was a total mobilization. The state ranked 9th among all 48 states in its production of military armaments, contributing 4.1% of the total U.S. output. The list of manufacturers reads like a Hall of Fame for defense.
Colt firearms,
Pratt & Whitney aircraft engines, Chance Vought fighter planes, Hamilton Standard propellers, and electric boat-building submarines and PT boats.
That focus on aerospace innovation is such a critical long-term thread running through Connecticut's history, and it's centered around 2 companies that still dominate globally.
First, you have Frederick Rentschler, who founded Pratt & Whitney in Hartford in 1925, specifically to develop aircraft engines.
A crucial supplier in WWII.
And today they remain one of the top 3 global jet engine manufacturers. Their influence on commercial and military aviation is immense.
And then the iconic moment in vertical flight came out of Stratford.
That was Igor Sikorsky. In 1940, he achieved the untethered flight of the first practical helicopter. And while helicopters had limited deployment in WWII, the subsequent military and commercial production made Sikorsky aircraft a giant. By the start of the 21st century, the Stratford plant had become Connecticut's largest single manufacturing site.
So Connecticut literally armed the country for 2 global conflicts. It evolved from small arms to the most advanced jet engines and nuclear submarines. We've moved far beyond selling wooden nutmegs.
And that defense infrastructure remains the backbone of a significant part of its modern manufacturing, dominated today by General Dynamics Electric Boat in Groton for nuclear submarines and Raytheon Technologies, which employs about 19,000 people through its subsidiaries like Pratt & Whitney and Collins Aerospace.
That sustained defense wealth is key because it sets the table for our next section, the dramatic shift into finance.
Okay, let's transition to Section 3, the modern economy. And the shift we're talking about is away from being a pure industrial forge into what is often called the fiery economy.
Finance, insurance, and real estate. It sounds like the state successfully leveraged its existing corporate infrastructure and capital accumulation to transition into high-value services.
That's exactly right. The shift is almost total. Fire air is now Connecticut's largest industry by gross domestic product, generating a staggering $75.7 billion in 2018.
Wow.
So while manufacturing is still important, finance is the overwhelming economic driver and source of wealth.
And where is this wealth concentrated geographically?
Primarily in two areas. The state capital, Hartford, which has historically been an insurance giant since the 19th century.
The insurance capital of the world.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And the famed Gold Coast Fairfield County, which is, geographically right next to New York City.
That proximity to Manhattan is critical, isn't it? It lets financial leaders live in a lower tax, high amenity environment while staying deeply connected to Wall Street.
Absolutely. Major employers like the Hartford, Travelers, Cigna, and Aetna solidified Hartford's position. But the real influx of hyperwealth came with investment services. Fairfield County, specifically, hosts major hedge fund operations, including Bridgewater Associates, which manages astronomical amounts of money.
One of the world's largest.
One of the largest. As of 2019, 16 of the 200 largest global hedge funds had their headquarters in Fairfield County.
This concentration of financial power leads directly to the core theme of our deep dive, this stark contradiction of wealth and inequality. Connecticut is one of the richest states, but it's also one of the most economically segregated.
The data is jarring. Let's start with the wealth. Connecticut is affluent by almost any metric. Adjusted per capita personal income was estimated at $77,940 in 2022, ranking it third highest nationally. It also consistently ranks among the top states for the number of millionaires per capita.
Okay, but the flip side is the distribution of that income. When we look at the Gini coefficient, which is the standard measure of income inequality, where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is perfect inequality, Connecticut scores 0.50.
A Gini coefficient of 0.50 is tied for the second highest in the U.S., trailing only New York. That figure isn't just a sign of, normal wealth disparity. It suggests a deep, systemic, entrenched economic and social segregation.
The wealth isn't spread out, it's highly concentrated.
Extremely.
How does that actually play out on the ground? The sources provided a perfect, stark example contrasting two neighboring communities.
You see it vividly when you compare the state capital, Hartford, with a wealthy suburb like New Canaan. New Canaan, often listed as the wealthiest town, has a per capita income of over $105,000.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Hartford, the city that hosts the state government and many of those insurance headquarters, is the poorest municipality, with a per capita income of just $16,798 in 2020.
That is nearly a 6.5-fold difference in per capita income between communities that are geographically quite close. And that gap impacts everything: school funding, infrastructure, local services.
Access to opportunity. And this disparity is overlaid with racial demographics. Connecticut is noted as one of the most racially segregated states, with non-white populations disproportionately concentrated in the major urban areas like Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford, while the high-wealth suburbs remain overwhelmingly white. The economic segregation mirrors the racial segregation.
So how did the state management help create this structure? You mentioned a major policy pivot that secured the loyalty of the financial industry, the 1991 tax change.
This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. Before
Yeah.
1991, Connecticut had this really unusual system. It did not tax wages or salaries,
Right.
but it heavily targeted investment income at an exorbitant 13%, the highest rate in the country, with no deductions allowed.
So that structure incentivized high earners whose wealth came from a job, but it penalized wealthy people whose income came from capital gains and investments.
Correct. So facing massive fiscal challenges, Governor Lowell Weicker pushed through this politically courageous but ultimately unpopular shift. He introduced a generalized state income tax, applying to all income.
And he equalized the rates.
He did, setting the maximum rate initially at 4%, which has since risen to 6.99% for the highest brackets.
Why did this attract the hedge funds? I mean, wouldn't any income tax be bad for them?
Well, while the initial rate on general income was new, the key was the elimination of that punitive 13% investment tax. For investment firms, which rely entirely on capital gains and investment returns, the new system, even at 4% initially, was exponentially better than the old one. The sources suggest this move stabilized state finances while securing the loyalty of the nascent but exploding hedge fund industry.
So it shifted the political risk burden onto the general working population while solidifying the state's attractiveness to high finance.
That's a fundamental structural trade-off. However, despite that lower general income tax rate compared to the pre-1991 investment rate, Connecticut residents still face one of the highest overall tax burdens in the country.
They do. They pay the second highest rate of combined state and local taxes at 12.6%, just after New York.
And the primary driver of that high burden is property taxes.
Property taxes in Connecticut are notoriously high.
They pay the third highest average property taxes per capita in the entire nation, behind only New Hampshire and New Jersey. And the state relies heavily on local property taxes because the basic political jurisdictions, the 169 towns, handle nearly all local services, including funding schools.
And since all property assessments are based on 70% of fair market value, if your home value is high, your tax bill is punishingly high.
Right, and this structure just reinforces the wealth disparity. Wealthy towns can fund excellent schools with a relatively low tax rate, while poorer towns really struggle.
It's an economic machine built on concentration. Shifting gears slightly, what other major sectors drive the modern Connecticut employment market?
Interestingly, the largest employment sector is not finance or manufacturing, but education, health, and social services. It employed 342,600 people as of 2019.
And that reflects the demands of an aging, highly educated, and dense population.
It does. And we have to mention the huge economic force created by tribal gaming.
The tourism and gambling industry is massive.
Foxwoods Casino, built in 1992 on the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation, was once the largest casino in the Western Hemisphere.
And Mohegan Sun followed 4 years later.
1996 on the Mohegan Reservation. Both are located in the southeastern part of the state and are huge employers and tourist draws, leveraging the state's decision to allow tribal gaming.
Okay, finally, a curious energy contradiction. The state is highly efficient in energy use per dollar of GDP, but its residents face the highest retail electricity prices among the 48 contiguous states.
Yeah, why the high cost despite the efficiency? It's largely a function of infrastructure, transmission costs, and relying heavily on a specific generation source. Over 40% of the state's electricity generation in 2019 came from nuclear power, primarily the Millstone Nuclear Power Station.
So it's clean and efficient.
It is. But the sources note that Connecticut has essentially no fossil fuel resources of its own. So that means natural gas and petroleum have to be imported, which raises prices, particularly in a high-demand, high-density environment.
That financial story brings us to Section 4, Geographical Quirks, Politics, and Modern History. And given the state's long history, its borders and political structure have some truly weird anomalies.
They really do.
I found the note about the coastline particularly surprising, given the state's deep maritime legacy. It's a coastal state, yet it technically has no direct ocean front. Wait, how is that even possible?
It's a matter of classification. The state's entire southern border rests on the Long Island Sound, which geographically is classified as an estuary.
An estuary.
It's an enclosed body of water where fresh water from the rivers mixes with salt water, and it offers protection from the high waves and intense storms of the open Atlantic.
So it's defined by being protected. The state has this huge maritime history, but its navy was fighting out of a sheltered harbor.
Exactly. The access to the open Atlantic is limited, either through the Race, that narrow strait near Rhode Island, or toward New York City. This protected environment was ideal for early trade and shipbuilding, but distinguishes it sharply from, say, the coast of North Carolina or Massachusetts.
Okay, now for two specific and complex boundary disputes that left permanent scars on the map. First, the Southwick Jog.
The Southwick Jog is that 2.5-mile square bulge of land that juts into Connecticut from Massachusetts. It's truly bizarre.
It looks like a mistake on the map.
It does. Its history goes back to the 17th century when surveyors just struggled to define the precise borderline. In 1804, the dispute was finally resolved. The southern part of the town of Southwick, Massachusetts, whose residents felt closer ties to Connecticut, successfully seceded, splitting the town in half and creating that visible square intrusion into Connecticut's territory.
That's a tiny piece of land that took over a century of bureaucratic wrangling to resolve. And the second is the Panhandle in Fairfield County, which defines the state's western border with New York.
That irregularity in the southwestern border is a direct result of 17th century territorial disputes with New York. In 1683, Connecticut and New York finally settled their boundaries. Connecticut agreed to cede a sizable tract of land extending north of Ridgefield and gave up its claim to the area of Rye, New York.
And in return?
In return, Connecticut was given the Panhandle area a concession to the residents of that specific southwestern area who strongly identified as part of the Connecticut colony. It shows how the will of the local people influenced the final jagged lines on the map.
Moving to governmental structure, Connecticut has this unique anomaly shared almost exclusively with Rhode Island, the elimination of county government.
Yeah, since 1960, the traditional county structure has been nearly entirely eliminated.
Why?
The shift came because in New England, local governance has always been centered on the town. Unlike in the South or Midwest, where counties perform centralized functions, Connecticut's 169 towns were the fundamental political jurisdictions responsible for schools, police, taxation.
So the county structure had just become redundant and inefficient?
Exactly.
So the functions are gone, but the lines still exist, right?
Yes. The old county lines still exist for geographical and statistical purposes, and the state's judicial system still uses them as districts. But the actual government functions, the commissioners, the budgeting, were all dissolved in 1960.
And what's replacing that for regional planning?
Because regional planning and federal statistical reporting require a larger non-town specific structure, the state is transitioning to 9 regional councils of government, or COGs. Yeah, these are collaborative bodies formed by the municipalities to handle shared services, infrastructure, and regional planning. And the sources note that these COGs are set to replace the old county lines for federal statistical purposes starting in 2024.
Let's pivot to recent political and social milestones. Despite its historical Puritan roots and conservative reputation from the land of steady habits era, Connecticut is now solidly a blue state.
Extremely blue. The political shift is profound. The last Republican presidential candidate to carry Connecticut's electoral votes was George H.W. Bush in 1988.
1988.
As of 2024, the Democratic Party holds all major statewide and federal offices, including both U.S. senators and all 5 U.S. House representatives. It is a highly progressive state within a highly progressive region.
And the 21st century has seen the state endure 2 major tragedies that have left lasting imprints, especially with its proximity to New York.
The impact of September 11, 2001 was immense. 65 Connecticut residents were killed in the terrorist attacks, the majority of whom were Fairfield County commuters working in the World Trade Center. The state's economic ties to NYC meant the human toll was catastrophic.
And then, in 2012, the incomprehensible horror of the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre in Newtown.
That tragedy, where 26 people, mostly young children, were killed, galvanized the state and the nation. The sources highlight that the massacre spurred renewed efforts for tighter laws on gun ownership, making Connecticut a flashpoint for the national gun control debate. The combination of those 2 events, 9/11 and Sandy Hook, has really defined much of the state's collective trauma and policy response in this century.
Finally, let's wrap up this section by looking at education, sports, and those powerful state symbols. The state is consistently ranked highly for education.
It ranks 3rd in the nation for overall educational performance, and this high ranking is built on a very long history of educational emphasis. Hartford Public High School, founded in 1638, is the nation's 3rd oldest secondary school.
And in Litchfield, the nation's first law school operated from 1773 to 1833.
Right. And today, Yale University New Haven acts as a centerpiece of the state's intellectual landscape, part of the wider knowledge corridor that stretches up to Massachusetts.
And when you mention the knowledge corridor, you have to talk about the athletic dominance coming out of Storrs, UConn basketball.
Their achievements are truly unique in collegiate sports. The Connecticut Huskies are the only NCAA Division I school to have both their men's and women's basketball programs win the national title in the same year.
A feat they achieved not once, but twice.
Twice, 2004 and 2014. And the women's program in particular holds the NCAA college basketball record for the longest consecutive winning streak, reaching 111 games. It is a source of intense regional pride.
And finally, those state symbols really tie together this whole deep dive, from the Puritan founders to the maritime economy.
The state motto perfectly encapsulates the origins. It's the Latin phrase, Cur transtulit sustinet, meaning, he who transplanted still sustains.
A direct reference to the early Puritan settlers.
Absolutely, their belief that God would sustain them. The official state song is the classic American tune Yankee Doodle. And fittingly, given the importance of New London in the 19th century, the official state animal is the sperm whale, a nod to its powerhouse whaling past.
Okay, let's connect the dots. What stands out to you as the ultimate takeaway from this deep dive into Connecticut? We've seen a state defined by these successive waves of innovation, the political technology of the fundamental orders, the industrial genius of interchangeable parts, and the modern financial engineering of global hedge funds.
It's a place defined by its structural contradictions. It is small, yet it shaped the federal government through the Great Compromise. It was an arsenal that armed the world, yet it's now an economic structure primarily reliant on finance, insurance, and highly unequal real estate values.
So the narrative is a perpetual tension.
A tension between immense, concentrated affluence and profound, entrenched segregation. It is innovative, skilled, and intensely separated.
And here's where it gets really interesting, connecting the constitutional beginnings with those territorial ambitions. We know Connecticut earned the title the Constitution State through its local foundational laws. But let's remember that 1662 colonial charter, the one that granted the colony control over land stretching thousands of miles westward, all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
That initial massive ambition manifested in the land claims that covered northern Pennsylvania and culminated in the Connecticut Western Reserve in Ohio, seeding New England culture and governance templates across the American frontier.
The lasting legacy of Connecticut isn't just confined to its coastal borders or the financial skyscrapers of Stamford. It raises a provocative thought for you to mull over. If the Nutmeg State's original territorial claims and political framework set the precedent for bicameral government and defined the legal settlement of the Northwest Territory, well, how much of the American West, from the Ohio Valley across the Midwest, still carries the invisible DNA of Connecticut's original Pacific-spanning constitutional ambitions? It is a small state whose influence stretched across a continent.